over to this computer. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good part of the day, everyone. Welcome to the first large-scale Scrum event of 2024. I believe it is the first one we run in this year. This is the fastest growing and the largest global community. Today we have our special speaker, and he has been our frequent guest lately, the well-respected Mr. Dave Snowden. Dave has been very well known in the industry. He's the founder and the chief scientific officer of the Cognitive Edge, his company. He's the a very frequent speaker at many global events, not just this one. Has done lots of contribution and has been very impactful and influential in the academia with the universities and institutes, as well as has done lots of research and public work. Today, specifically, I've asked Dave to speak about artificial intelligence and its impact, its influence on HR domain, HR norms and policies. He has some good experience in the domain, and will share some of his insight. For many companies these days, this has become almost like the new shiny object. They talk about AI, AI, artificial intelligence. So I think it would be great to hear Dave's view on the same. And without any further ado, Dave, may I please pass the baton over to you? And thank you again for being here with us.
So I think the value here is if we get into some sort of dialogue reasonably soon, right? And what I'm not going to do is to go through the different types of AI and the different types, that for me is not a particular interest in this context. My interest is the consequence for how human beings make decisions within organizations. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from. So a couple of things by way of build up on this. Something like 25 years ago, I was sat at a conference in Washington on the same platform as John Poindexter. And somebody said, "What do you think about AI?" This was a counterterrorism event. Neither of us was sure who'd been asked first. So we both said simultaneously, nobody's thinking about the training data sets. Yeah, everybody's thinking about the algorithms, but nobody's thinking about what you train the buggers on. And that to me has always been the most significant factor. In fact, one of the things that SenseMaker, our software, was originally designed to do was to produce epistemically balanced training data sets. Yeah, it's the old variation of garbage in, garbage out. Yeah. So I was working in a hospital yesterday looking at the role of AI. And part of the problem, if you look at melanoma capture, it's actually extremely effective on white-skinned people, but not black-skinned people. And the training data and the doctor's opinions come from a period where there was a lot of inherent racism in the UK, and that comes through in the way the system actually works. If you want to read more on this sort of stuff, there's a paper called Scholastic Parrots, which was written by a Google employee and published by an ex-Google employee because she lost a job over it, right? Which started to focus on the training data sets. So that's kind of like one significant factor. And to be quite honest, I think it's probably the most, it's one of the top three, right? If you don't think about where your training comes through, where an algorithm has been trained for, you've got a real issue. One of the good things the Chinese government have done, which is far more effective than anything we've seen in the Europe or the States, is to say nobody can sell AI without declaring how they trained it. That's a very simple rule. And that would be useful. And I would not, if I was in a company, buy or use any AI system where somebody didn't tell me how they trained it or how it would be trained in situ. Right? So that's one factor. I think the second factor is we need to stop anthropomorphizing AI. In fact, the very name is a problem. Yeah, AI is a set of algorithms which uses data and produces other data. That's what it is. Yes, it's simply algorithmic inference. Yeah. In fact, and I'm writing a blog post series where I'm finding different ways to use AI as an initial. Yeah. Started it a couple of days ago, moving on. Yeah. It's not a person, neither can it be a person. Yeah. One of the reasons for that is human beings evolved to actually do what's called abductive reasoning, and computers work entirely on inductive reasoning. And even Bayesian logic hasn't managed to replicate human abductive thinking. So I want to spend a bit of time on that because it's important. Yeah. So abduction is one of three types of reasoning from logic. You've got deduction, induction, abduction. Deduction is kind of like, you know, if A, then B. Induction, to summarize, is kind of like, well, we've got all these things, you know, where we actually see A and B associated, so we can assume some correlation. And that really is how every single AI system works. It has training data, it looks at things, it does probability forecasting. It's always using a form of inductive logic. It's using the past to inform what it tells you in the present or about the future. Abductive thinking, which is the great contribution of the American pragmatists to logic, is sometimes known as a logic of hunches. So kind of like, one way to look at it is, it's what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things. Yeah. I've just written an article on this, which will get published in about 2 or 3 months' time. But the whole point about abduction is this plausibility test, right? It's kind of like, we can see these things are connected, but we're not quite sure why, but it's plausible that they are. Yeah. And an AI system can't do that, whereas human beings can. And one of the reasons we can is that actually we use abstraction, and we use our bodies, and we use our social environment. So human decision making and human consciousness is not confined to the brain. We're not a low grade, or as somebody famously said, the human brain is not a low capacity information processing device. I still have never recovered from seeing that in my daughter's textbook. I withdrew her from the subject immediately when I saw it. Yeah. We use our body to make a significant amount of decisions. If you look at the knowledge in London Taxi Driver, it's 2.5 years before the hippocampus enlarges sufficiently to actually hold and manage the knowledge base. And that works radically differently from a sat nav. And I want to spend a bit of time on that difference, which is important. If you look at London taxi drivers, we have this quaint concept in London that we train them. Yeah, we don't just give them a license. No. And the way we train them is they spend 2.5 to 5 years driving around the streets of London in their own time with a map of London strapped to the handlebars of a motor scooter. They're called the knowledge boys when they're doing this, by the way, until they know the name of every street and every route within London. And the exam is to be given any 2 points in London and to describe the route out and the route back, turn by turn, mentioning every major landmark. It has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. Nobody has managed it in less than 2.5 years because the hippocampus has to physically change shape. This is one of the first cases where we realize the huge role the body plays in human cognition. It's not just about the brain. Yeah? But it actually does more than that. So I was an expert witness when they were trying to replace effectively London taxi drivers with sat navs. This was before Uber, but it's the same sort of issue. So we'll put this technological device in, it will navigate. And there were 2 forms of argument. One was, that's not as adaptive as a human being, because the sat nav is dependent on its map. And even with real-time feedback from things like Waze, the map is still a fundamental scaffolding. Human beings can handle things which radically change because they haven't got underlying structure. So I could argue it on that basis. But the real point where I won the argument is when I actually asked them to look at the sexual assault and rape statistics between black cab drivers and ordinary cabs. And the difference is huge. You hardly ever see sexual assault from the black cabs, but you see it frequently from other types of transport. And one of the reasons is that 2.5 years of socialization, of joining a profession, being examined by your peers, actually creates an ethical standard. And that's what in Deleuzian terms we call an assemblage. It creates a pattern of the way you see and act in the world, which comes from social interaction over time, which then actually gives you capability you wouldn't otherwise have. So there are kind of like three approaches to abduction that you see in the world. One is the pragmatist. This is Quinn and Pierce and Dewey, which is about hypothesis generation. The second, which is the Batesons, both Gregory and his daughter Nora, which uses metaphor to create these leaps of insight. The third is ours, which uses abstraction or art to detach yourself from the material so that you see novel connections. And we think that's the major role of art in human evolution, which is why, given that education comes into this, if you focus on STEM education, you are really damaging human knowledge and human intelligence. Yeah, abstraction is key. But I'll come back to the point, human beings, so the famous case where, AI beat the Go player until they changed the rules of Go. Then the Go players adapted immediately, the algorithms didn't. Yeah, so it's that adaptability, that ability to handle novelty, which appears to be something that abductive reasoning gives us. If I take an evolutionary perspective on this, kind of like if abduction didn't have high utility, it would not have dominated over induction in human evolution. It gives us the ability to see novel connections, to radically repurpose things, to bring things together in novel ways. So one of the key things we're now starting to look at is, can people distinguish between abductive reasoning and inductive reasoning? And one of the things we'll be announcing next week is actually an audit tool to measure the percentage of your employees who are able to think abductively, either individually or socially.
Was kann ja wohl nicht wahr sein.
Sorry, that somebody hasn't switched off their mic. Yeah. Now that's actually important because you need that capability in an organization when novel things happen. AI will be more problematic at that point, apart from the bias issues. The other issue, which kind of like relates to that, is, I'm trying to think of the best way to actually put this. The real danger with human beings is we're lazy and we're prone to magic. So if something appears magically to do something which we then don't have to do, we'll go along with it. And when recently there was a big article in the Harvard Business Review about Boston Consulting Group, where consultants from Warwick and Harvard and elsewhere studied 7% of the total Boston consulting workforce and discovered that the ones were significantly more productive if they used AI in their work. And this was lauded as a reason why AI should be picked up. My comment on it is it just shows the poverty of consultancy. Because all they're doing is synthesizing existing material, which AI will always be better at. If AI can pass the Wharton MBA, then the Wharton MBA isn't worth the paper it's written on. And we've increasingly focused on synthesizing existing material, and to say AI is actually significantly better than that. But then there's an epigenetic problem. If we look at Eva Jablonka's work, and this works both ways, the level of symbolism in your speech, the degree to which you use semiotics, actually influences the intelligence of your grandchildren. And that's kind of like quite scary if you think about the implications. But also over 3 generations, we can lose capability if we don't use it. I can smell snow coming, my children can't. Right? So the danger is, that actually AI will make us lazy enough. We lose a human capacity, which is critical under conditions of uncertainty. So I say one of the things we're about to launch is an ability to measure the ability of your workforce to think abductively, to create novelty or connections in a space, rather than to think inductive and follow a probabilistic forecast. Another problem on this, and I'll just ramble through a few more things and stop and open up, is we have this significant problem in that Microsoft have discovered that they might be able to restore themselves to their previous level of dominance through ChatGPT. In doing so, they've thrown morality out of the window. So when they had to make the choice about who the supervision was going to be of ChatGPT, they basically went with middle-aged male billionaires from Silicon Valley, threw all the women off the group, and basically said, we're not going to actually contain this stuff. It's a magical thing. Somehow or other, it will mysteriously, if we let it run wild, save the planet. And there's variations on that. And as I said several times, we wouldn't let people play with nuclear fission in their back garden, so why the hell are we doing it with AI? Yeah. So there is this fundamental issue. And the other thing that Microsoft have done is they're using the Word model, the Office model, to sell ChatGPT. It's a corporate sale, high level. Yeah, I mean, we got told in one client, you must not criticize AI. Yeah, that was from the board. AI is our future. You must stop criticizing it. You must stop being negative. Yeah. And I just pointed out that AI is capable of writing viruses once it's behind your firewall. So it's a modern day technologically sleeper. And they hadn't even thought about that. Right? And I can give you more similar examples. But you've got this sort of fabulism that we actually saw with, as I say, with Microsoft Office. Yeah, it's this apex predator. Here it is, do it, it will magically work. Yeah. So we got to start to think more critically about this sort of stuff in terms of the way we work it. Yeah. And that was kind of like, I think probably at that point, I'll sort of slow down and open up for questions. But just to summarize, training data matters. People are not focused on training data. Last time I was at the MIT bookshop, I got very depressed. And by the way, this is my favorite bookshop on the planet. I keep saying it's terribly impressive that they give me free canvas bags, but then I realize how much I've just spent there. Yeah, and the canvas bags to carry it, right? But there's one book I didn't buy last time I was there, even though I was tempted, because I didn't want to encourage the author. And the title was Correlation is Causation. And that's a really strong trend in Silicon Valley. If we just have enough data, magically the algorithms will not need human input. So just as with children, how you train them matters. Yeah, so training data sets are key. Epistemic balance in training data sets is key. Secondly, you need to understand the degree to which humans can discriminate between AI and non-AI generated data. Right? And you need to discriminate on the amount of people, because you need about 5 or 10% of your workforce who are active abductive thinkers. They're the creatives. Yeah. And if you replace them with AI, you're actually damaging your long-term resilience. Yeah. And as I say, we need to look at the marketing models. So you've got two groups here. One is closed AI, which is the big software companies. The other, which is actually more scary, is open API, which has been actively promoted by libertarian right-wingers because they don't want any restriction on what people do with it. And that, to my mind, is even more disturbing in some ways. Yeah. So there are good things and bad things. Yeah, we're looking, for example, at the moment on clinical trials. One of the things we can do is measure placebo.
No.
So one of the things we can do is measure placebo effect. Yeah. In order to get that, we need to relieve people of a reporting burden. Now, AI is very good at producing compliance reports. It's a useful thing because you control the feed, you can give it the form. You're not asking it to do anything original, you're asking it to tick a box for you. But when you ask it to do something which needs original thinking, that, to my mind, is where it goes wrong. So high-level summary, jotting notes. I'm still writing this up as a whole blog series at the moment. We're working on a series of software tools to create this audit capability for companies in terms of attitudes, beliefs, fears. That will include presenting ethical dilemmas about the use of AI and measuring how people actually respond to those. Yeah, so we can measure the degree to which there's ethical awareness and ethical attitudes within the organization itself. So, high level, stuff there is probably controversial, some isn't controversial, at least I hope it isn't. Open for questions and dialogue.
Very well. Thank you, Dave. And folks, once again, I do ask you to keep your mics off unless you explicitly ask. I know there's at least one great question in the queue. I'm going to call upon Gage Hutchins. If you don't mind, just speak up. You have a great question in there.
Hey, Gene. Thanks so much. Let me just, sorry, flip my camera on. Apologies on that delay. Thanks so much, Professor Snowden, for this fascinating and insightful thinking. I was just wondering if you could maybe explore a little bit more with us this idea of discussing with vendors about their training data sets. I think I understand the logic of the ask. What I don't know or have really no clue about is what does good look like? If that makes
I think
sense.
that's something which is evolving. We do know it needs to be balanced. So, for example, if you're using sociological data which goes back more than 10 years, assume it's racist and sexist.
Mm.
Yeah, because it will be, particularly from experts. All right. Look at what happened when people actually used AI to actually do recruitment. They trained it on previous models of good leaders. All the previous good leaders were male. So guess what candidates it selected? Yeah. There is no discrimination in AI. The discrimination is in the data you feed it. Yeah. So either you control the data feed for the training, and some aspects of AI will do that. Yeah. I mean, I don't think RAG is enough, but that's getting there. Or somebody selling AI has to actually declare fully how they trained it in its basis so that you can actually decide whether it will work for you or not. And the Chinese have done that. Now, that's an easy thing to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Folks, the floor is open. We just ask for light discipline. Please just ask a question and go back on mute. Anyone?
Yeah, I have a question.
Hand up.
I am thinking of maybe what the positive story can be, and maybe if from the HR perspective, we try to implement tools for recruiting, for example, how can we make sure that we can actually assess and use our own criteria to identify what's going wrong?
I actually think that's one of the disastrous uses of AI. Because all that will happen is, and you can buy algorithms which actually improve your CV, so the AI is more likely to select it. Yeah, you get into these sort of wars of interpretation. Yeah. And that's the danger, right? So you're losing the human ability to make a decision. We know human beings actually are quite good at making decisions about people in 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes it's biased, but overall it actually has good results. Yeah. So I think that's a problem. Where we're interested in that, which we do, for example, is we actually do cultural mapping. So we select CVs based on their cultural match or mismatch. So if we want to disrupt an organization, we're not going to bring in people who think the same way as the people who are there at the moment. And the other thing we're doing there at the moment is to produce what are called attitudinal or identity maps. Because these days, people of different gender and different skin colors often have more in common than other people, yeah, in the same category. So it's like identity underpins the traditional divides of gender, sex, and age. Yeah. So one of the things we can now do is measure attitudes and attitudinal diversity, which we think is significant. So I would select based on soft factors like culture and attitude and disruption and conformance, and then interview people. What I would not do is have anything which actually sorted things based on text. Unless you're dealing with a task which is so routine, you're probably going to use AI for it anyway. Yeah. Oh, and while I remember, you do know that the carbon footprint of one training data set is the equivalent of a transatlantic flight.
Great, thank you. Margarita, thank you for the question. Goes to Joe. Joe, you have your hand raised, please speak up.
All right, thank you. I have a question. Do you ever think that AI will be able to replicate humans and commit like identity theft?
I think it would be very easy for it to commit identity theft. All right, I think, and we can already see that. We've already got cases of people who've committed suicide because their AI coach told them to. Yeah, that's actually quite scary, right?
That's tragic.
Yeah, well, there's going to be more like that. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at one system when I was in New Zealand, which is involved in New South Wales, which is, it gives people an avatar to talk to. And I remember challenged the guy and said, how do you handle pheromones? So we know that pheromones are key to trust decisions in humans, which is why a physical interview tells you more than a virtual interview. Yeah, how people smell tells you a lot about them, but you don't realize it, it's subconscious. Yeah. And they'd actually handled that. So I was impressed. And he showed me the results. And I said, well, what happens if a bad actor gets this and uses it to cause mental breakdown? And he said, no, nobody would do that. And then I went and checked. with one of the major intelligence agencies in Europe, and they said, "Yep, they're already doing it." Because an algorithm, yeah, can actually look at your whole history on social media, your other history from the press. It can then start to feed you data which actually causes mental breakdown. All right, so these are all really dangerous things that we're not really taking account of. Yeah, I may not have answered the question, in which case you'll have to ask it again. I got into one of my pet hate subjects there.
Very fair game. Thank you very much. The question, great answer. I'm gonna go to Jay Kumar. I think.
Yeah, hi. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes, yeah. Actually, thanks, Dave. My question is around, HR is involved in various areas, right? Like recruiting, performance, inclusivity and diversity, and a lot of other areas, right? So as of today, where is the major data AI is using, in which of the areas of HR profession that you think AI is using currently?
I actually don't know because I haven't studied it. Anecdotally, I would say recruitment. Yeah, I think performance measurement is more problematic and they're hitting issues on that. And by the way, there does seem to be a law of diminishing returns with ChatGPT. The more you use it, the less effective it is. And we can see some reasons for that, right? So I think recruitment it's kind of like sorting and selecting. And that's where we get the big problem with training data sets, because those are traditionally biased in terms of the way it works. As I say, I think there are better ways of doing that. I think we work on what are called vector measures, which measure direction and speed of travel. And those are more effective for measuring effectively, and they're narrative based, but they're more effective, and they're quantum narrative. But they're more effective in measuring whether something is working or not working, because they don't assume you can define an outcome in advance. So if I'm quite honest, I think the role of AI in HR is to allow you to synthesize data into compliance reports. And the other area we work on is what are called anticipatory triggers. All right, so this is stuff we originally did under DARPA for counterterrorism. So if you gather the weak signals continuously, because if you have a look at a major terrorist incident or any major disaster, 9/11, people identified that people were learning to take off and fly but not land. And after 9/11, we realized how significant that was. Yeah. But it is generally true when anything goes wrong, anybody with the benefit of hindsight can say you should have paid attention to these things. Right? But hindsight doesn't lead to foresight. It's the law of large numbers. It's all this sort of stuff. But what we started to do was to actually gather the data which was available to people when they didn't know what the outcome was, and then effectively create training data sets from that data based on whether there was an outrage or not, and use that on incoming intelligence reports at scale, not to say terrorism is about to happen, but to alert human beings that they should look at something. Yeah. Now, to me, one of the really good uses of that, and we spent years working on this in HR, is to identify, for example, where you might suddenly get a whole bunch of people resigning together. Yeah, or where you may actually have an ethical issue in the way your people are handling it. You may not know this, but people in the UK know this. The big hot topic at the moment is we have now discovered Fujitsu in our post office for 30 years actually lied and kept people in prison because they didn't want to admit that their software was faulty. Truly, people committed suicide, people lost their money, people ended up in prison. Everybody knew the software was faulty, but they all denied it had happened because they didn't want the financial consequences. Yeah. Now that is an ethical failure on an epic scale. Yeah, it's look you can look it up. Yeah, but look, just type Post Office UK, you'll find it. There was actually a documentary actually done on it. And the whole point about that, and this is the trouble, right? Once people, so thank you for saving that, but would you take it off the screen, please? Or is that somebody just hacked us?
Yep. Sure to that.
Last time this happened, I ended up with a male masturbating on front of me in front of a car. I've never quite forgotten on that one.
One second.
I think you've been hacked.
Remove. Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so that was actually a good example. I didn't set it up. AI can do that at scale.
Good example.
Yeah. And there's an old adage I came up with years ago, anything explicit will be gamed. So that the Horizon scandal, which is what's it called in the UK, is the sort of thing you get when people make decisions based on algorithms based rather than on humanity. All right, and that has widespread implications on this. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer, Dave. Anyone else other than Joe, the fake? Any other questions, folks? Seems like a very powerful conversation. Jason, go ahead.
Thank you. Dave, do you recommend building the AI and data set in-house as opposed to purchasing from a vendor so this way you can actually control it from the grassroots level?
Yeah, I think so. I think the danger when you go down a vendor route is, I mean, I do not believe the major vendors will put the inhibition into their AI that they should.
Agreed.
Right? And if you can't, and actually ChatGPT consciously has decided to not actually put stuff in. I mean, that was when they had the change. So if something goes wrong, you can turn it off. Yeah. So I would be deeply suspicious of that, but I would also be hyper cautious on any open source software. Right, because it's almost, you know, the chance of it being having, you know, sleeper type code in it is actually really high. So you need to be very careful, and that's why we're looking at the ability of humans to discern, and when you trigger human beings into doing something, right, so that you don't just rely on the algorithms. Yeah, and that's key. So you need to design the social architecture around AI as much as you design the software architecture. And that involves trust and checks and feedback loops. Remember when AI was doing financial trading, it put the world into a major financial recession. Right? Yeah, you can do the same thing. I mean, the way the Israelis are using AI in Gaza is really problematic because there's no human discrimination involved in the targeting. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer and the question. Let's move on to Sam. Sam, you're up.
Hi. Yeah, so certainly understand that generative AI is just looking at probabilities between things, but the thing, one of the concerns I have is that it's looking at probabilities of the next token. A token is not a whole word.
Yeah.
So maybe you have some comment on why it's useful at all. I'll give you an example word, Antichrist.
Yeah, I've seen that one. I mean, I think it's overhyped. I'm sort of mildly optimistic because, I mean, I've been using it for about a year and a half now, and it was really good at the start, and it's less and less good as it goes on. If I'm quite honest, Grammarly Plus is a lot better than ChatGPT in actually improving what I write because its training is better. Yeah. So I think we're going to see hype. I think we're going to see companies go through that cycle. I think what will then happen is there will be one or two disasters, major PR disasters. Yeah, and the fact the pharmaceuticals are amongst the early adopters, they're prime candidates for something disastrous to happen. And that will switch the pattern, right? And make people sort of realize. To be honest, the real issue with AI at the moment is what it's going to do to elections in Britain and America and Europe over the next 2 years. And that is the single most significant, scary aspect of AI. And that's where the money will go. Yeah, the Pope and the puffer jacket is the one everybody broadcasts. A whole bunch of people believe that. Yeah, we've already had our Prime Minister in a fake video, which was eminently believable. They're getting more subtle about this sort of stuff. Yeah, and it's not something you can handle with fact checking. You need your audience to be discriminating. Now, in a company, you can make sure your employees are discriminating, but at population level, that's a bigger problem. We are actually, by the way, I will be in Washington on this in March. We are actually now looking at how you increase empathetic at a high empathetic bonding at a hyper-local level across the political divide, and to do that algorithmically at scale. Because if you have high empathetic relationships between people, red and blue in the States, then they're less likely to believe the propaganda. But if they have no relationships with anybody on the other side, then the propaganda makes them more vulnerable. That in complexity terms is we're trying to change the substrate in which people discriminate on information. Trying to control the information is a lost cause, but you can control the substrate. So if anybody's interested in that, we're about to do that in Germany with a view to trying to stop the neo-Nazis getting control in 2025. We're looking to see if we can do something short-term in the States before November, though I think that may be too close. But that issue about increasing the humanity of networks at a micro level across political divides, and that refocuses ourselves on humanity rather than information. We've become too information-centric the last 30 years, far too information-centric.
Thank you for that. I know we have two hands raised. One person it hasn't allowed me to break the pattern, just a little bit lazy. You wrote something. I'd rather you speak about this, if you don't mind, about personally using AI by Dave.
Oh, when I'll happily talk about that. I use it as a search mechanism. It's sometimes better than Google.
All right, that was a short answer.
Given up trying to use it to rewrite, but actually it's quite cute as a search mechanism. Yeah, but I mean, any expert will tell you this. The more you know about the subject, the more you know how bloody stupid the results it gets. So its value is where you know little. And that's quite depressing if you think about it.
Thank you, Thank you for that. Just to be fair, Karen, you had your hand, and then we'll go back to Margarita because she has her hand as well. Yep, to the point. Karen.
So, Dave, good luck on your work in DC. Please let us know how that comes out.
If it works, you won't know about it. Just to be
Pardon
clear.
me?
If it works, you won't know about it.
Well, maybe just us. You can tell us, just us. But I was wondering what do you recommend to us humans, as the best way to navigate through all this? I mean, if you're submitting resumes, they're assessed, analyzed for the, with the ATS systems. So,
Okay, so two things. First of all, remember that at the moment, several elite American schools are banning in AI and computers from their classroom because they think it will give their elite kids advantage over everybody else. Right, just think about that. All right, if you grow up playing outside, dealing with whoever's playing on the street, if you have to read books, if you have to do those sort of stuff, you actually have a richer intelligence than somebody who has just used computers to feed them information. And the fact the elites are moving down that direction is quite significant, right? On the other side, if you have to play the game, play it. So if the person who's looking at your CV is using an algorithm, buy one of the algorithms to improve your CV. All right, because that's
but then you're going to be judged. If you consider yourself kind of a unique human that can do unique things, but you're going to be judged on an algorithm that is not really appreciating uniqueness.
I totally agree with you. I think it's wrong. But if you want a job with a company which runs it, you probably have to play the game.
Downward spiral. Here we come.
It is, and I would never do it, but I've worked on the basis I'll do what I like and to hell with the consequences. And I've been lucky, right? But a lot of people have done that and not been lucky. So I don't blame people if they play the game in order to make sure they feed themselves. Yeah.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Moving on, I think Margarita was your turn, and then we'll go to Lennon, and then we'll go to Gage. Go on.
Yeah. So a bit of an anecdote. Today I was actually interviewing a data scientist for a role because we are looking to implement AI built in-house build. And one of the things he mentioned is he has learned how important it is to make sure your data is set on place before going and hiring a bunch of data scientists to do AI. And connecting to this, it just makes me wonder, my role or the role of the HR, or if there should be someone making sure that this data is created and, as you said, trained in an unbiased way, similar to how we do potentially calibrations of performance.
It's a compliance issue, right? So at the moment, companies aren't setting up compliance departments to deal with this, and they're going to have to anyway, because the regulation will increase. Yeah. And the minute there's a mistake, everybody will be looking for somebody to blame. So that's one factor. Generally in IT recruitment, by the way, I would follow what Richard does in the Midwest, which is brilliant. Anybody can apply to join for his company, and they're put on a pair programming team for 6 months, and at the end they mutually decide whether they want to keep themselves or not. Because the only way you can really understand whether somebody can fit into a programming team and do something is to give them 6 months working with somebody else. So I think you're going to see more models like that for recruitment, yeah, than you are with the sort of classic CV approach. And remember, that was partly HR's problem. And up until the 80s, most people were recruited from school and stayed in their companies for life. And then when business process re-engineering came along and we switched from a military metaphor to an engineering metaphor, which was a disaster in the 80s, people were actually swapping jobs every 2 years or every 3 years. Yeah, and then we had competence levels, and we had, the pseudoscientific nonsense of things like Myers-Briggs, and the one with the bloody colors, which have no basis in any real science whatsoever, because people were treating human beings like widgets, which could be put in and out of a manufacturing process. Whereas if you go back to Taylor and scientific management, he actually emphasized human judgment and human interaction. And I think that's where the competitive advantage is going to come in the next 3 decades, is the ability to use software as a tool. And the whole point about a tool is when you pick it up, it should fit your hand. You shouldn't have to re-engineer your brain to fit the tool. And that's one of the problems with AI. It's a sort of reverse engineering and a dumbing down of human intelligence.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Lennon, you have your hand, please.
Yep. Thank you very much. 2 questions here. Well, kind of a 2-parter. As we see the disruption in recruiting for new roles, what types of roles do you think will be disrupted the most? And what are the types of roles that we should coach people on to future-proof themselves versus AI?
I think one of the things we're moving towards at the moment is decision-making in what are called role combinations rather than individuals. All right, so the evidence of our evolutionary history is we evolved to make decisions in extended families and clans. We're actually really bad at individual decision-making. And if anybody's read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, don't tell anybody in cognitive neuroscience if you took it seriously, because you'll never be invited around for dinner. They published a whole book called The Invisible Gorilla to counter it. The reality is human intuition and decision-making at individual level is really bad. Yeah. But put us in combination with people of different backgrounds, and this is where neurodiversity is becoming important, and HR are not paying attention to neurodiversity except as a discrimination thing. They're not seeing it as an advantage. You put somebody with dyslexia in a team with somebody with Asperger's syndrome, you've got a more powerful person than either of the two individually. So we're now looking at recruiting people into groups of 5 or less. The maximum number of actual effective decision makers in an extended family is 5. So we evolved to compromise in groups of 5 or less. Put us in bigger groups, we go into our tribes. So we're now seeing recruitment as recruiting people into combinations of roles that make decisions, not individuals. And we're about to start experiments in the health service where one of the roles is anonymous, so nobody knows who it is. And once we do that, we can actually allocate money without bureaucratic control with more audit capability. So we're seeing a shift in organizations to network type intelligence and effectively working with clans and extended families rather than individuals. And that allows you to recruit ordinary people. And I'll make the point, everybody talks about recruiting extraordinary people. Well, not everybody can. It's like one of our former prime ministers said he wanted every school to be above average, which rather indicates his wasn't. All right. The military recruit people, who just turn up, and they make them extraordinary by process and by role interaction. Yeah. So I think we need to switch the recruitment into people working together in different combinations. That allows us to change the combinations when we need to. It allows the people to pick up the pieces. You don't want to have this highly individualistic focus, which is why I'd also get rid of things like capabilities and competences, which again have absolutely zero base in any cognitive neuroscience. They're actually emergent properties. Yeah, it's like, people who are creative are innovative. Well, actually, creativity and the innovation both come from the same phenomena, which is starvation, pressure, and perspective shift. It's on a causal link. Yeah, so I think that's where we need to be going at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very
And
much.
by the way, just to complete on that, you can find thousands of examples in nature where networks actually are better at finding resources, even though they have no intelligence. There's things called levee walks, for example, which I've written on recently, which we're now building into some of our processes. There's the waggle dance of bees. Yeah, there's the way that microconzial fungi redistribute resources between trees under conditions of starvation. Yeah, and human beings are able to handle networks at a much higher level than in nature. The trouble is, North Atlantic thinking post-Enlightenment, and actually post the Reformation, I blame the Reformation for it. I'm a good Catholic, so you'd expect that. Yeah, focused everything on the individual. They said it's all about the individual. And actually, that's really bad anthropology. Yeah, humans are collective creatures. We're social creatures. That's where our intelligence comes from.
Thank you very much. Gage, I know you are trying to raise a question, please.
Thank you, Gene. Professor, I'm also a good Catholic and a convert, and find it interesting as well, that shift away from individualism. But and I really enjoy this talk. I am curious, so something you had mentioned early on in your conversation, so I'm taking us out of this thread. You had talked about you're working on some software to test abductive reasoning. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little more about that effort. I'm very curious on how you're viewing and approaching that.
It's early days, but what we're doing is we're actually using cartoonists to create dilemma situations, yeah, where there isn't a right thing to do. For anybody in the Agile community, we'll actually launch a pre-version of this next week. You're working with Comic Agile, where your employees pick a Comic Agile cartoon which represents the culture of your organization, index it, and we show you a cultural map. And that, by the way, will be important for recruitment. Yeah. When we go on to the next level, we introduce dilemmas. Or we present 6 situations, some of which actually can only be resolved abductively, some inductively. We pick which people choose. We identify how they solve them. We identify the level of abstraction in their solution basis. So, I mean, our approach, by the way, my background is theoretical physics and philosophy. And we're taking a physics model. So we start with a theory. We start with natural science. We don't start with empirical observations because that's inherently biased. No social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. So we start with cognitive science, we start with complexity theory, we start with quantum mechanics. We say, what does that tell us? We build methods consistent with the theory, just like physics, you start with the maths. Then we hand it over into the experimental physicists, who are the people whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists. Sorry, I display my bias here. They do the experimentation to get it right, and then when it's boring, we give it to the engineers. So that's our process, but with slightly less pejorative terms. So we finished the theory development. We're now in the experimental stage where we know it will work, but we don't know quite how it will work effectively at scale. So that's what we're playing with. Yeah, we know how to measure culture already. We know how to measure attitudes to ethical dilemmas and safety dilemmas. So this is kind of like the next stage on from that. But if you watch this space, we will be announcing a lot in the next 2 weeks. And it's going to be fairly cheap for the next 2 months because we want to build a benchmark in data. So for the moment, we're going to make it easy for people to buy in. Yeah. And before we do that, so there's a lot going to come out on that. We're looking at a complete portfolio, starting with attitudes to AI in your company, hopes and fears, then monitoring to make sure you've got the requisite diversity in place to actually not be abused by the AI. Yeah.
Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Adrian, thank you for the question. Folks, we got T-6. We got maybe 5 minutes and 1 extra minute too, so you can get to your next session. Any other questions? Anyone else wants to as going once was Matt, thank you.
Yeah, earlier you made a comment about when they're trying to apply AI in HR type of domains, that they're struggling with having it effectively work with performance management. What are the struggles that they're having?
I think part of the problem is the way AI went, where HR went. I mean, I started, after I played around with being a Jesuit and then worked on the program to combat racism in the World Council of Churches. I ended up in HR because the only people who wanted me were HR because I had the international experience and I was young and cheap, right? And we were an international survey firm. And HR then was an ex-military guy, me, and a secretary. That same company now has a HR department of 35 people.
Huh.
And HR has become a sort of industrial complex. I still remember recruiting 50 people and taking on a really bad project so I could get my profile right for my department, so I could pay my high performers what I needed to pay them because I had an imposition of a pattern. Yeah, the growth of psychometric testing, which again is A, I think unethical, and B is bad science, that's HR driven. Yeah. So what's actually happened is HR has moved, and it's an interesting question on the glass ceiling, by the way. I challenge people on this. If they say we have more women senior managers, and I point out the most anally retentive control department in most companies is HR, and they're dominated by women. So, context determines more than gender, I think. Yeah. So I think one of the issues is you actually got to change the culture of HR to actually be more about enabling human interactions rather than controlling them. Yeah, I mean, I've just had this row with somebody in our own company. I've said, look, we need to measure everything. We need to get data. We need to know our cost of sale. We need all of this, but we are never, ever going to use it for performance management, because then we're not treating our people as people. We shouldn't we shouldn't have people in our organization who need to be managed for their performance, or we should allow peer pressure to do it. Yeah.
Very well. Thank you, Dave. Anyone else? I just want to make sure we get some additional diversity questions. Who else hasn't spoken and wants to do a wrapping question? We got maybe 2 minutes remaining, folks.
Hey, hi, I don't know how to raise my hand. I can't find the button. Sorry.
Please.
I've been listening. Thank you very much. And I've been trying to make a connection between AI and your sense-making framework. And can we look forward to such an article?
We have 3 sense-making frameworks: Cynefin, Esterine, and Fletcher's curves.
The Cynefin is the one I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, you could make that connection. The problem is AI actually operates in the complicated domain. Human beings handle the complex. Yeah, because, the complex is about acceptation. It's about abductive thinking. It's about novel connectivity. It's about networks. I mean, all that AI does is it does complicated things at huge scale. I mean, AI is deeply autistic. And ironically, sorry, I should go into my favorite joke. Most AI has been written, by misogynist males in their early 30s who live in Silicon Valley and take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which is grounds for being committed to a mental hospital, right?
Brilliant.
And, we need to address this sort of stuff, all right? In terms of the way we work. We need human beings working with other human beings. And we need to and I'll keep repeating this, technology is a tool. A tool has to be usable, but we also can't afford to become over-dependent. Another example, right? So I go walking most weekends. I've got an Achilles problem at the moment, but I'll be back 2 weeks in time, with 3 doctors. One of whom, by the way, is called Di Lazarus, which is the single best name I've ever heard of for a doctor, right? Di is the Welsh diminutive of Dave, and we have Old Testament names, all right? That's New Testament name, sorry. So basically, I go walking with them, all right? And 3 doctors is an argument, it's not a cure. So if something goes wrong with me, I know I'll die while they have an argument about what's wrong with me, then they'll be having the blame. 1 doctor would be a sanity measure. But they actually say, but we go walking, we all have GPS. But every 4 or 5 weekends, we only use the map and compass. And every 6 months, we navigate without anything in the dark. Yeah, so we can keep those skills. Yeah, the US Navy, one of the biggest personal procurements in the US Navy in recent years has been sextants. Because they know that the AI may collapse navigation and people may have to navigate by the sun and a time clock. Yeah, so we need to maintain the human skills in parallel with using the new tools. I wouldn't be without GPS, but I know I may be, so I need to be ready for that.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for the question, and Dave for the answer. Folks, we're actually at the time. Dave, do you have extra 2 minutes?
Yeah. Fine.
I'll take one more because I think, I'm not sure if it's John or Matt. We need to time box for 30 seconds each. I know you haven't asked, so I'm going to give you a chance. John, go.
Hey, Dave. Do you, given your study and decisions, do you have an approach that you recommend for conflict resolution at scale?
Yeah. Sorry, that's what I was working on this morning, right? So along with a few other things. So back in the 70s, when I was working on peace and reconciliation in Ireland, yeah, in what I was brought up to call the 6 counties, but other people called Northern Ireland, there were 2 approaches to, well, language matters if you ever go there, right? I still remember I was walking down the Falls Road. I got picked up by the police, thrown into the back of a police Land Rover because they were Protestant, and asked which of my legs did I want broken first. And when I protested, I would prefer not to have my legs broken. They heard my accent and realized I was a mainland Catholic, not an Irish Catholic. And there would be trouble if they beat me up, so they threw me out of the van. It was that bad. Right? If the Provo commander had come around that night, I might well have joined. Yeah. And yeah, that level of injustice was common. Yeah. And I can tell you some stories about Back Bay in those periods as well, which was quite entertaining in Back Bay when the boys came around to collect money, right? So there was one approach, which was Colomira, which was, we get everybody into a room with some really nice white middle-class facilitators. This is the Peter Senge Otto Scharmacher approach, by the way. Yeah, and tell them how if everybody was like us, the world would be a better place. Yeah, and of course, everybody agrees in the room that they will be nice to each other. Yeah, and then they go out and they're throwing petrol bombs again. This was wonderfully satirized in Derry Girls. If anybody hasn't seen Derry Girls, it is one of the great comedies of all time. Episode 1 of series 2, the Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys, watched over by a trendy priest, a cynical nun, and a cynical Protestant teacher. And they have 2 boards. Yeah, all we have in common, all we have different. And at the end of the first session, the board with difference is full of stuff like Protestants keep their toasters in cupboards. Yeah, Catholics like ABBA. I mean, it is that level of trivia. It is actually now in a museum in Ulster because it is so typical of the period. It all ends up with a massive conflict in which they all fight each other over a minor misunderstanding. So it's really brilliant, all right? And I'll put a link in because you can just watch that bit. I think, yeah, it's on a YouTube, yeah? So that's there. So we took a different approach. We took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, or vice versa, and we dumped them into Latin America for 6 months on an ecumenical project. And they discovered pretty fast they had more in common than they realized. And they talked about their differences without facilitation when they were ready to have the conversation. And that created lasting relationships, which came across into the Good Friday Agreement. You can tell we were Jesuits. That's a sort of fairly typical Jesuit approach, yeah? It was working indirectly, not directly, which comes from complexity. Well, that's what we now do. So I can get school children to act as ethnographers, and we've done this in 3 countries in the world very successfully. They gather stories from their community. We can then algorithmically identify which stories are in common from people from different political districts. We can then actually give people who come together from those 2 districts to work on that common problem a small amount of money to do their project. And what we're doing is we're increasing empathetic connections between people in a completely different context. Yeah? And that we now know how to do at scale. If anybody knows a friendly millionaire with 20 million, we actually, and we got the baccalaureate on board with this, by the way, we want to have every school child at the age of 17, every school in the world act as an ethnographer every week to their community. And that meets a huge amount of educational needs, because then that can actually tell us what's going on. We're defining input rather than to an algorithmically certified output. Yeah. So that's been a big thing for me the last 20 years, is working on that.
Thank you. And last question, this is the last question, is from Matt. Matt, could you please time box it?
Sure. Other than what you were saying earlier, because I think this partially answers the question, is, what can we do, in this new world with AI? Keeping our skills definitely makes a lot of sense. What other things or other thing would you recommend?
Ask questions. Yeah, the most effective way of getting people to think differently is to ask them questions they can't answer. You need to be careful on this. The trouble is, if you do philosophy, you're trained to do this. It's called Socratic questioning. But you have to realize that the people of Athens got so fed up with it, they voted for Socrates to commit suicide. So you need to be careful on this one, all right? But I mean, there's two things. I mean, for my many and various sins, I had to read Trump's tweets every morning for 4 years when he was president. And then when he got blocked, I suffered from, withdrawal symptoms from moral indignation and righteous indignation for the next 3 hours afterwards. Yeah, this is the project I was doing with MIT. What Trump was brilliant at was using key phrases to keep a story structure running that people couldn't counter. And every time people ridiculed Trump or countered the story, what's called an assemblage, yeah, it became worse, not better. And a lot of our work is, and for anybody who's a Deleuzian scholar here, we're heavily based on Deleuzian epistemology. We have to deterritorialize those narratives. So instead of allowing people to be in a social media environment, you move people into highly local interactions with people they already know. Yeah, that deterritorializes the system, so you change the way. That's going back to the last question. So increasing human interaction in systems is absolutely vital. Asking difficult questions like, well, why has it come up with that? Yeah, or what would be the consequences of that? It's absolutely critical. If you want senior executives to change, they've got to work it out for themselves. You mustn't tell them. So the basic model is assume it's a 13-year-old immediately post-puberty who's lying to get out of the house, and use that as a framework for actually managing it. Yeah.
Thank you. And on this topic of puberty, we're going to wrap this up. I really want to thank, first of all, Dave. I really can't say this enough. Thank you very much for coming out and doing this for us. We had probably a record attendance today, 130 plus people. So I really appreciate you doing this. The recording should be available in the next day or two. I thank everyone as a group and individually for coming out and participating, asking questions, and just making this a nice and interactive, dynamic environment. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of the day and your work day, your weekend, and once again, thank you very much. We're gonna adjourn now.
Thanks all.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.